Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Patrick, and thanks, Job, for those introductions. Very delighted to be here and to have all of you around. As Job indicated, essentially, this is a pre-launch of the work that we've been doing. And so I'm going to run you through some of the highlights of that study so that we can be able to get your feedback, your input, as we conclude the final report. After lots of debate and changes, we decided to title this paper, Guns Everywhere, the Military and Transition Politics in Uganda. And again, as Patrick mentioned, it's a study done by 4 of us. We've spent the last about 7 months working on this study, going back into the history and trying to understand what is the position and what is the position of the military, or what is the potential impact of the military in a potential transition process in Uganda. Basically, we have the way we have structured this paper. The presentation is, I will talk about the motivation for the study. Job has already highlighted a bit of that, the methodology, and then the report itself. And the way we've done the report is really to take a historical approach and see, and be able to see at every point in our history, how does the military look like, how does it behave, how is it constituted, and what exactly is it. So, as Job indicated, did I lose anything? Let's see if we can. Sorry about that. This is a very complicated platform. Published a study based on some work we are doing. We have a study group called Uganda Political Transition Scenarios Thought Leadership Group. We meet every other time and look at the changes in our politics, what is happening, the number of factors that could shape the transition process. So we've had all these conversations over the years, and a number of the members of the groups are in this room. But in 2021, we decided to synthesize the work that we had done into a paper called Uganda Political Transition Scenarios to 2026 and beyond. We are already looking at the idea that we would have elections in 2026. So we wanted to understand what would the situation look like as we move to 2026, and then the elections, and then after the elections. So we are trying to think and project the future, because that's what scenarios work does. Based on that work, we framed the 3 scenarios that could happen. First is what we call the flying crane scenario. The flying crane scenario is basically the scenario where, given our historical circumstances and the things that have happened, that we as a country will come together and sit on the same table and discuss the future and agree on how to move forward. So that is the flying crane. That the conditions are available for everybody to sit on the table, including those who do not like each other. Because at the end of the day, we don't have to like each other. We just belong to the same country. We are Ugandans, nothing that can change. That's a historical fact. The fact that we are Ugandans, you can't change it. So the idea was that we could sit on the same table and be able to talk about the future, and therefore that would signal a peaceful transition into the future. The second scenario is what we characterize as the storm in the teacup. The storm in the teacup is really a situation where things are changing, but they are not changing. The more things change, the more they remain the same. So you have the economy is not doing well, the insecurity is prevalent. You are looking for jobs, you can't find them. So you can find that if you are looking for the good things, you can find them. If you are looking for the bad things, you can find them. And therefore, you are moving, but you are not moving. I call that, sometimes I call it developing in a circle. That around the circle, if you are developing in a circle, around the circle, you are making a lot of mileage. You are clocking a lot of mileage, but when you think of the distance you've moved, you actually haven't moved very far. So that's the storm in the teacup scenario. And then the last one is the warrior mad king. The warrior mad king scenario is the scenario where the incumbent president, Yoweri Museveni, we described this and said, his mental programming is that he's a life president. So in other words, no matter what you have you think about him, he wants to be president for life, and all the institutions of state are being configured to ensure that he's a life president. So that means that the only way, and going by history, all the leaders that have pursued the life presidency project, normally violence escalates. It keeps on escalating over time. And that is evident even in our politics here, that if you look at especially our elections, you realize that our elections have been becoming more violent over time until 2021, when we had to kill each other. And now people are already dying, including people dying in the NRM primaries. So you can see that the violence is likely to escalate because those are the conditions that we have. So having published this paper and we continued to have these discussions, then we said we need to look at some of the factors that define the warrior mad king scenario. And we could look at a number of them because we had looked at the young people, the position of young people in the political process. We're looking at the economy. The economy is going to be a major factor, how the economy shapes up. But we chose to look at the military because we think it's a very important factor in this process. So the way we approached this study was to look at the political transition theory. Transition theory. There's a lot of work that has been done on political transitions. Some of the major studies that were done by Woodrow Wilson Institute, based in the US, looking at Latin America and Europe. But actually, the interesting thing is that all the findings from those studies basically can easily be applied to Uganda with the differences in terms of context. So the first framework we looked at was the characteristics of a functional democratic state. Because basically, when you talk of transition, the understanding is that you are transitioning from a bad situation to a good situation. You are transitioning from authoritarianism to a democratic dispensation. So then the question was, what are the functional characteristics of a democratic state? The United Nations Development Program basically highlights three characteristics. One is presence, that the state is present in our lives, and it is able to provide the basic things that we need. Normally here in Uganda, it's called service delivery. People just call it service delivery. Sometimes you feel like if you ask people what is service delivery, you don't feel like actually people know what they are talking about, but it's a political jargon that we are delivering services. Some of you are politicians. The Gerards, if you go to campaign, say, I'm going to provide services, probably without even knowing also what those services are. But those are politicians. The second one is safety and sustainability. A state is supposed to ensure our safety. That wherever we are able to, you are supposed to feel safe. And safety in terms of the environment and the conditions in which you live. the challenge that we've had in Uganda here, when we look at and the reason we titled our paper the guns everywhere, is that everybody, there's a mental programming that we've been programmed to think that safety and peace is determined by the number of guns around you. So in other words, if you move around and see people armed with guns, then you say we are secure. They say, recently I attended a function in Ntungamo there of an LC3 chairperson. But if you saw the guys, the number of army men and the police who were carrying guns at the function, you would expect that they were expecting an ADF attack. That's in Ntungamo. Okay. But essentially, the interesting thing is that every leader who would stand up to speak at the function would point to those armed people and say, now there is peace. So that's how we have been programmed to think now. And then the third functional characteristic is hope. That you are managing an economy that provide in a way that you provide hope for the people. The future always keeps bright. I think we believe that at this point, when you look at our conditions, we are at the point of hopelessness rather than hope. And that has implications on how a society is able to transition. So when you think of transition, there are basically three different forms of transition. One is reform. That's according to the literature. You can look at three forms. One is reform. Reform normally happens when the incumbent regime is the one that is managing the transition. So in other words, a regime like the Museveni's regime can get into a comfort zone and feel like we are in charge, and therefore they try to reform the system. Normally when that happens, there isn't a lot of margins that you gain, because the ruling political elite is the one which is reforming, and therefore they are more focused on protecting their interests. The second one is compromise. Compromise happens when the population is so organized and agitated that it is putting pressure on the incumbent regime, and the incumbent regime feels threatened, or especially the political elite within the regime feel threatened, and they realize that the only way they can secure their future and secure their interests is to be able to negotiate with the pro-democracy forces. And then the third one is the overthrow. That if there is no reform and the population is organized and agitated, but you can't achieve a compromise, there is pressure on the regime that eventually the citizens and the security forces actually could get an alliance and overthrow the incumbent regime. So these are the three types of reform that you will see. When either of these will lead into a transition, and basically either it's a military coup or power grab that involves a military coup or a civilian coup. A civilian coup can be a constitutional coup, an electoral coup. Then there is the hybrid, where there is a compromise, and then of course there are democratic elections in some cases. So these are the different forms of transition that happen. But our major focus really was to see, so in these transition mechanisms, where does the military fall? And for us to be able to do that, then we had to understand how do we understand Uganda as military? So what we did was to take a historical approach and go back to the pre-colonial period and see how has Uganda's military been organized over the years. This you may not be able to, I think it may not be legible enough. But essentially we've mapped out the military, starting with the kingdoms, because according to the historical accounts, Kabaka Mutesa and Kabarega actually had normally what we would call home guards. But as the colonialists came in, they then changed these home guards into a standing army. Originally, they were really guys who were attending to the parish. But as the colonialists came in, the fights between Buganda and Bunyoro intensified, and then they started training and equipping standing armies. But we know that in 1894, Uganda became a protectorate of Britain, and it was placed under the British East African Company, IBEA. Yeah, I'm sure even the young people who do, I don't know if they still do the history, where we study IBEA. But essentially, IBEA was like, had a contract to manage Uganda. So Uganda was a business of the British, managed by a company called IBEA. For the NRM people, I normally say that my understanding of NRM is like the contemporary version of IBEA. That you have a country, it's run as a business, and this company is meant to be able to ensure everybody is engaged in the production of goods, mainly products. So it's IBEA that introduced the first military in Uganda by bringing soldiers from Equatorial Province in Sudan. And so most of these soldiers who came to support the work of IBEA they were basically mercenaries comprised mainly of Nubians. So they are the ones who took over and started supporting IBEA in doing its work, including some of the historical cases that we've seen, the subjugation of Bunyoro, Buganda being able to attack Bunyoro and subjugate it, the time when Kabarega and Mwanga go to exile. This is still IBEA in operation. And so we've done that timeline to see how this has evolved over time until 1962, when that army was handed over to the post-independence government, or the independence government. That army is handed over now as Uganda Army. So what was King's African Rifles is now called Uganda Army, and we basically start from there, from independence. So up to 1962, the Uganda Army is mainly the characteristics. Some of the characteristics are it recruited many as mercenary force, substantial involvement of foreigners, mostly Nubians. For most of the time, it's owned by IBEA. It's under the absolute command and control of the governor, and this is what is passed on at independence. So essentially, we inherit an army, and you'll see that this process actually continues over the years. So after independence, then we look at the military from 1962 to 1995. These are basically our timelines in terms of how we do this analysis. So what you see from independence is an army that deeply gets into the politics of the country. First of all, I should mention that as early as 1964, that's when we had some changes within the military. The Armed Forces Act of 1964 was like the most significant legislation after the Armed Forces Ordinance of 1957. So the Armed Forces Act of 1964 organizes the military into the Air Force and the Land Forces. In 1966, we have the army attack the Kabaka's palace. And therefore, and normally that is, 1966 is a defining moment, because then it is defined as the moment when the army becomes a big question in our politics. Fast forward in 1971, the army deposes deposes Obote and installs Idi Amin as the president. And essentially it's the army that is now in charge, running up to 1979. In 1979, as you well know, the Idi Amin's army, so that is Uganda Army now, is overthrown by the Uganda National Liberation Army, UNLA. So for the first time, there is an opportunity for us to constitute a national army. because the former army has been completely disbanded. So if there were any understanding that we needed to create a national army, 1971 would have been one of those, 1979 would have been one of those moments. Because UNRA was mainly comprised of Tanzania People's Defense Forces and then elements within the Ugandan exile groups. But what happened in 1979 is that guys who were already focused on power, and in particular President Museveni and Oito Jok, realized they needed the armies to be able to have an influence on the power structure of the country. So both of them started recruiting their own armies. So by the time of the elections in 1980 December, Oito Jok had recruited 36,000 soldiers, and Museveni had recruited 24,000 soldiers. So basically, you have soldiers or armed people that are aligned or loyal to these individuals. So after the elections, and you know the elections again, we have the military, it is still in charge, because that's the military council. The military council is the one which organizes the elections, and we know the stories around them, no matter the contestations, that the military council is the one that organizes elections and hands over power to Obote. So you can see that consistently, the army is able to hand over power to you and take it when they want it back. So that's basically what you see throughout the history. So in 1981, Oito Jok's group became the UNRA. Museveni's group transforms into a rebel group called NRA. I don't know, General, if you were already in that group. Not yet. But essentially, that's how the structure is moving as the military. So we have a 5-year war. One important anecdote there is that Oito Jok died in 1983 in a plane crash, in a helicopter crash. So because, and you can see that because the army that had been recruited was recruited by Oito Jok, once Oito Jok died, it was difficult for Obote to control the military. And therefore, the conflict started emerging, and eventually there were disagreements within the military, and Obote is overthrown by Tito Okello Lutwa, who is eventually overthrown by Museveni and the NRA. So that's 1986. So what do we have in 1986? In 1986, a rebel group captures state power, and declares itself the national army. In other words, in short, anybody can still talk about the people's army, because NRA likes describing itself as a people's army. But really, nobody determined how they were recruited. So someone sat down, worked out a project, recruited an army, went and fought and captured power, and declared his group a national army. And sometimes these are hard facts that people do not want to talk about, because in this country, one of the things we found out in the research is that it is very, very sensitive to talk about UPDF or NRA and not call it a national army. Very, very sensitive. But those are the facts. Those are the facts, because this is someone's army. Of 1986, essentially, the NRA declared itself the national army, and then it formed the government, mainly led by its commander and the chairman of the NRM. So one of the things I would want to emphasize is the code of conduct of the National Resistance Army, because that's one of the instruments that really continuously has defined NRA during its operations. no matter the challenges, the NRA was, again, was known as a disciplined force. One of the things that we found is interesting is that where there was insurgency, in areas where there was conflict, actually NRA was as brutal as any other force. In areas where there was peace, you could definitely see a force that was very pro-people, very friendly, and it was fun being around them. But when you start looking at the conduct of the NRA in eastern Uganda, in northern Uganda, and now some of the cases we've seen in KIZZA and others, you realize that actually NRA is an army. It's like an army like any other. So the question of discipline is something that still has to be interrogated. Is the NRA disciplined because it's operating in a good environment, under pressure? Can it still maintain the same level of discipline that normally is attributed to it? So effectively, I would say that from colonialism up to 1995, you basically have military rule in Uganda. So in other words, because sometimes we tend to look at military rule when we are ruled by a military person. But actually, all through, it is the military in charge, it is the gun in control. So that's the point up to 1995. So in 1995, we have our road junction. We are to determine whether we can move towards a democratic state or whether we continue with on the same trajectory. So 1995 is the attempt to try to correct things and create a new dispensation on how the military can engage or can play a more proactive, a more positive role in the politics of the country. So the normative framework that is established in 1995 is under Chapter 12 of the Constitution. That's the one that establishes the Uganda People's Defense Forces. And incidentally, we've deliberately said in 1995, the UPDF, the NRA is baptized the UPDF. Because the Constitution didn't change anything. It's only said, the name of NRA changes to UPDF. So in other words, from 1995, we were supposed to engage in a process to be able to restructure the UPDF and make it a national army, taking into account the normative principles that are provided for under Article 12 or Chapter 12 of the Constitution. But we've had we've looked at the different legislative milestones from that time up to the present, and this is what we've tried to explain how the UPDF changes or does not change. Because in 1998, the then Minister of Defense, Stephen Kavuma, brought regulations to authorize the deployment of UPDF in DRC. Some of you may, those of you who were born at that time, you may recall that at that time, President Museveni had deployed the UPDF in the DRC, and there was contestation. So Stephen Kavuma brought regulations to regulate the deployment of forces, and the Parliament refused to pass them, and said there was need for a comprehensive law to govern the UPDF. So that did not pass. But in 2000, we have the National Security Council Act. The National Security Council Act, these are very interesting pieces of legislation. Our view is that we haven't paid enough attention to some of these pieces of legislation. Because the National Security Council Act establishes an entire structure from the national to the district to the sub-county. So you're looking at a national security committee at the sub-county, and we begin to see the level of securitization and militarization of the society, taking that vertical approach up to the local level. So that's 2000. In 2003, the then Defense Minister Mama Mbabazi introduced another law, a bill, the UPDF bill, 2003. Again, that bill was contested. It went into limbo. It did not proceed until 2005 when it was activated. And that is when the debate on the UPDF Amendment Act 2005 started. So this act, until recently, was actually the main framework for governing the UPDF. But one important point to note is that at the same time, around 2000 and 2004, there was a defense policy review, a comprehensive review of Uganda's defense architecture. One of the things we found interesting is that in the policy, there are policy objectives on defense for Uganda, and then the policy objectives on defense for the UPDF. And then the question is like, so who is who and what is what? So you begin to see the discord actually coming in the way the UPDF is organized and its mandate. But in the in the debate of the act, that's where you see the ghost of NRA coming to dominate in the military. So we've picked here a quote from Kaindo Tafire, who basically argued and said, because a number of issues were, one, the government wanted to legislate the original command of the UPDF as at 26 January 1986. And then, and the MPs were like, but why do we need this when this is now the UPDF? Because we are no longer NRA. You remember NRA recently, someone recently came with the paperwork and said he got a certificate of UPDF in 1982. It's the same ghost that is really eating us up. Yeah. So we are in UPDF, and then we are saying we need the commanders, we need the high command of the UPDF as it existed as of January 26, 1986. So Kaindo Tafire argued very strongly about the inclusion of these people, saying that they needed to nurture the UPDF. And unfortunately, he had included himself in the high command. When Mama Mbabazi published the list, he had excluded Kaindo Tafire. So Kaindo Tafire dropped off the list of the high command. So essentially what you have here are the list of the high command and then senior army officers as they existed as at 26 January 1986. So these are you'll find them in the law. And they have remained up to today. Because our argument is that the UPDF has never changed from NRA. It actually remains NRA. By its DNA, it remains NRA. You have had a number of things change, but the real architecture and the DNA of this army is the NRA. So basically we've made a series of conclusions having looked at these at some of these what has happened over the years. That one is that what we've seen with the UPDF and all the amendments that have happened, including the 2025 bill, which I'm going to talk about briefly as I conclude, is that we've seen almost a military coup happen. And we call it a military coup by other means. A military coup, normally we know that the army organizes itself with their guns, they take over government. In our current situation, there are no guns. There's no shooting of bullets, but actually the army is taking over government. One is that, we have the tweeting general. Yeah, the tweeting general, the fact that a chief of defense forces can refer to a national army, this is my army, these are you call it, the choice army, the characterization basically reduces the character of the institution of the UPDF into a different animal. Because it just doesn't happen that way, that a national army can be characterized by anybody the way they wish. So they are there as listening posts, and we've looked at how they have, all the time they have been there. When you see the changes, when you see the changes that now, from the junior officers, all you see now is that at this moment, you actually have 4-star generals in the parliament. So that has been changing again. The army and religion. The army has gotten deeply involved in religion. Either as, sometimes you actually think that even when they are going on the front line, they ask for a prayer. This country has become so prayerful. I have been protesting the prayers as an agenda item, because I said, no, General, don't feel bad about it. I always say, every agenda item is supposed to be discussed. So you can't have an item on the agenda which can't be discussed. But the point I'm trying to make is that when you look at the UPDF now, there is a way it has tilted towards more of spirituality. Whether that is good or, no, or bad, we are not really making any judgment. But to get a point, to the point where you have a person of a Rueru's character now running a church, and you know it's kind of like confusing. By the way, I don't know whether you guys get confused like me, because you see, so you see the army functions, there are all these clergy people, and you feel like there's that capture. We've looked at the army and the cultural institutions, very deeply involved. Some of the chiefdoms now are run by army officers, and we believe that that's not by coincidence. And then, of course, we have looked at how the army has taken over the public service administration. That's something that is you can see across the board, that almost all institutions of state, the army has literally taken over, including some of the ministries. I think the Minister of Defense is like the classic example. Minister of Internal Affairs, where you have the senior minister, the deputy minister, the permanent secretary, the director for immigration, the director for citizenship. It's like a military installation altogether. And we don't think that that's by coincidence. Because the argument has been that these army officers are more patriotic, they are more disciplined. When that happens, it means that the other institutions are basically, they have collapsed basically. So you are trying to do a displacement. We've looked at the army and the economy, and that also has, you can see the trajectory very clear. Especially, I think this intensified after the Operation Wealth Creation, where the army officers were literally deployed in every sector or agency of government. You'll find there either the army officers working there, or if there are no employed army officers, you'll find what they call OWC coordinators. We've looked at all of that. And then, of course, there's the capture of the Uganda police, which has really taken place over the time, and we have provided all the evidence to show how this has happened. And then army in elections, which again takes back the role that the army is playing today in elections is no different from what the role they played in 1980 elections. Just to conclude, by looking at the UPDF Amendment Act, we've characterized the UPDF Amendment Act as almost the return journey to the NRA. Why are we saying this? First of all, there were two bills. The first bill of 2024 was actually the most important aspect of that bill at that time was the introduction of health services initiative, or the establishment of health services for the UPDF. And so with the Supreme Court amendment in the Kawazuguraka case, the NRM people went blazing and said, no, we have to provide for the trial of civilians in the court-martial. When you look at what the law does, and maybe we could look at just 2025, the 2025 bill introduced 81 new clauses, and 68 of these were, these clauses were amending 68 sections, 53 by amendments, but also repeal of 15 sections. Normally, ordinarily, if we are really running a smart system, this is a law that would have required a repeal of the previous law and enactment of a new one. Yeah, because you see, it's not very easy to debate a bill that is amending a previous law to this extent. All you do is to confuse those MPs and make sure that they don't pay attention to what we are doing. And because everybody, all the MPs, including all of us, focused on the trial of civilians. But essentially, the most important aspects of that law are not about the trial of civilians. That's just a consequence. It is not the problem. What is the problem with the law? And why are we saying that it is a return to the NRA? One is that law changes the composition of the UPDF. Because under the 2005 Act, the UPDF is comprised of two segments, the Land Forces and the Air Force. In the current law, they have codified the Special Forces as a service. Remember that in 2005, one of the most hotly debated issues was the Presidential Guard Brigade. If you remember the PGB, that was one of the issues that was debated hotly. And Amama Mbabas had to come out and give assurances to the MPs that there was no attempt to legislate the PGB because then it was considered a presidential protection unit. Once the law was enacted and the PGB was excluded from the bill, the regime went ahead to construct the SFC into the force that it is now. So in other words, you can comfortably say that that is an illegal outfit because the Constitution is the one that the Constitution provides that it is the Parliament to prescribe the composition and function of the UPDF. So what the President has done is to ask MPs to basically endorse what he has done over the last almost 25 years. The second issue that was debated intensively in 2005 was the reserve force. Because MPs were asking, why do you need to register a reserve force? Because reserve forces, in most cases, these are retired officers who have gone back to civilian life. There is a mechanism for recalling them when there is need. So again, that was rejected by members of parliament. But what the regime did is after the law, they went now under the Ministry of Veterans Affairs and constructed a whole service called the Reserve Force with the structures up to the sub-county level. In most cases, if you look at places where there is election violence, the Reserve Force is one. Members of the Reserve Force are some of the elements that actually perpetuate election violence at the local level. But these are structures that have been organized outside the law, and then the law now comes and endorses them. So that, for me, that is significant. Number two is what we've called the escape clause. There is a provision called auxiliary forces in that law, where the president as commander-in-chief can co-opt any group of armed, any group that is trained anywhere and make it part of the UPDF. And you know that's what has happened. The LDUs, the Amuka, is it Amuka boys? The different groups that have now, they go, in other words, I can go and start my militia group and train it, and afterwards, it is incorporated into the UPDF. When that happens, it means that it is happening outside the law, because Parliament is supposed to prescribe how you recruit and train UPDF officers. So it's a very dangerous clause. We can assume that Museveni would not use it, but a President Kamara can just bring all these groups into an army without following the right procedures. Number 3 is the fact that this law did not sort out the Defense Forces Council and the High Command. And again, this is one area where we don't pay attention. Under the Constitution and the National Defense Policy, the UPDF is supposed to be subordinate to civilian authorities. But what does that mean? How is that subordination expressed? In principle, the Defense Forces Council should be the civilian institution that prescribes policy and structure of the UPDF and how the UPDF is governed. That's the Defense Forces Council. So that's where you would find your civilian authorities. The High Command is the command of the army, which deals with command and control and administration. The trouble with our legislation, right from the 2005 Act to the current one, is that the Defense Forces Council, other than the president, the minister, the state minister, and I think if I recall the permanent secretary, Minister of Defense, other than those 3, the rest of the members of the Defense Forces Council are the members of the High Command. So in other words, practically, there is no difference between the High Command and the Defense Forces Council. One would have expected that the legislators would have been looking at that to make sure that this underlying principle of subordination of the military to civilian authorities is achieved through the legal structure. And then, of course, the last one is what we've characterized as the unlawful combatants. With the UPDF Act, the 2025 Act, each one of you is an unlawful combatant. So in other words, if anybody is holding a gun around you, we can arrest you. It depends on it may depend on the mood of the arresting officer. But essentially what the law has done is to say, if you are connected to someone with a gun, if you are holding a gun, you do this, basically, you can be tried in the court martial. And but the major implication of this is that the regime itself has no trust in the civilian judiciary institutions, and that is a crisis. So in other words, there are 2 things that have happened, and that's what I will end up with. One is that the most important conclusion from this study is that over the years, President Museveni has constituted a completely parallel military government that is parallel to the civilian government. So on the civilian side, there is an executive arm of government, the president and his cabinet, there is the legislature, there is the judiciary. With the enactment of the UPDF Act 2025, there is an executive arm of the military, which is the Defense Forces Council because it has executive authority. There's actually the president and the CDF. That's the executive. There's the legislature, which is the Defense Forces Council, which has basically been, even because the language that is even used in the law is that the Defense Forces Council can prescribe, which is the language that we use in law, relating to the legislature. And then now there's the judiciary. So you have 2 parallel governments. So in this scenario that we've described, the warrior mad king, we envisage a situation where actually President Museveni can ignore you, the civilian government, your MPs, your LC5 councillors, chairpersons. He can ignore you and deal with the military, and if you bring Manyanga, we can bring you to the military government and deal with you. That's what you are going to see as we move forward. But essentially what the UPDF Amendment Act And read together, by the way, the one I didn't mention is the UPDF establishment 2021. Now that is another important document that very difficult to read, but when you are a researcher, you have no choice but to read it. When you read the UPDF establishment and the UPDF Act 2025, what you see is a complete shift of balance of power from we the people to the army. That at this moment, the most important action that we should be doing as citizens is how to get back our power from the military, because I think by every measure, legislative, financial, coercive power, the power has basically shifted to the UPDF or to the military, and that is our biggest question of the day. So thank you very much for listening to me. That's what I had to share with you.
To hear your views, I'm sure you want to hear from each other, and this is the moment when you can also have your say. And the general want to go first. Can I have the microphone taken around? We have to review that request moving forward, because if everybody is going to the podium, yes, that won't work. Yeah.
I'd like to thank the team of the authors for work, research well done. I'll try and make a few comments and then run, because it looks like, unfortunately, we've run through, beyond our scheduled time. I had fixed another appointment somewhere. All authoritarian regimes always create architecture for security control of the citizenry. It's just obvious. And normally we use the state security apparatus as tools for suppression of any dissent. That has always been the case since the beginning of time. So this is nothing new. And maybe to first respond to what was asked about the 27th. The Fronasa forces, when they joined, when they were merged into UNLA, and then the war in the world started, those who, even when they had the opportunity to join the Bush, who left, by the time we took power, I don't think there were even more than 1,000, out of about 15,000. So the rest simply remained in the, the UNLA. Even those who had the opportunity didn't leave. Maybe someone could do research and find out why that would happen. But the tendency of human beings, when they're in a position where they think that they are secure, they stay there. That's part of humanity. We even see happening now. The comments I wanted to make were, what attracted me most, and I think what concerns us, because much as we look at this study, it's a good foundation on the basis of which we can try to see how to shape the future, different from what is. So the last, I don't know whether to call it, I think it was the last bullet where there was unlawful combatants, trial of civilians in the military courts, is the most significant in as far as I'm concerned in this whole study. Because the rest of the study captures what happened in the past. It's part of our history. There were opportune moments when things would have been different. One, for example, 1964, when there were mutinies in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. I think Uganda at that time it was KAR. There was a mutiny here. The arrested the Minister of Defense, the late Felix Onama, held him in what eventually became Gaddafi's Jinja. What did Uganda do? What did Kenya do? What did Tanzania do? The only country which took a different position was Tanzania. It used that opportunity, dismantled what used to be the King's African Rifles, and started afresh from a fresh foundation. Here, nothing like that happened. It's so surprising that the two coups also which took place, look at those who were in command. First, General Min. General Min didn't even reach peaceably. Look, second time, General Rutwa. General Tua also left in primary, but they were commanders of the army. But there are many educated Ugandans, there are many educated people in the forces. But it's not, that's just, so currently, the question to me, the most critical question that we need to look at is, how on earth would a parliament in which more than 300 members are members of the ruling party, which ruling party is the one that supervises what we are talking about now, the current status of it, educated, but also representing the rest of the country. That's what the dilemma is. Since you are researchers, it will be interesting for you to find out, for example, now, in the primaries, now, in 2025, and the one is in 2021. You'll find that a significant number of people who are running for primaries of NRM do research. How many believe in NRM? For me, when I bump into them, you'll find that about out of 10, those who believe in NRM could be about 2. The rest don't, but they still run on that ticket. Then you could also find out what are the levels of education, what are the professions they're in. Because you find many doctors, many lawyers, many teachers, professionals of all kinds, accountants and the rest in there. But they pass such a law. So where is the problem? The status of the political environment in any country is a reflection, as far as I can see, of the levels of consciousness of the citizenry, 1. 2, is also a reflection of the character of the elite. So to solve this problem, you have to deal with those 2. Before you deal with them, it will continue, deepen further. There is no end to this until there is a level of consciousness in the citizenry, deliberate effort to raise it, but the most critical and immediate one is the character of the elite. You work on that, you resolve that, this one can easily be made history. May God bless you all.
When I look at the military in Uganda, we do not have a military dictatorship as defined in other countries where there is military dictatorship. What we are having is a warlord. What we are having is like the Wagner group. What we are having is like the group of genocide, Dagalo in Sudan. When you see how the army operated recently, you saw them, they were increasing their salaries. It wasn't Parliament doing so. Because there was a request in Parliament of the money of the intern doctors, the money wasn't there. Teachers wanted the money, they've been told to wait a little. But these who work for an individual, who work for the family, whoever they want, they promote. Even when the laws are there for somebody to retire, you can't retire. So when we do not look at how what was named the UPDF, Kamari must have had Brigadier Mayombo defining what the UPDF was supposed to mean and what we have today. People forget that if you go the roles of the UPDF, the register, nobody's register is DF, it is RO. Resistance what? Office and number something. So the word UPDF remains among the people of Uganda. But what Mr. Museveni looks at, he looks at his army. That's why when you see how his son operates. He's actually like a de facto third number two. You know, we have many number twos in this country. Beside Major Arupo, who people think about, but there's another number two. So if we don't look at it as that way, that we do not have an army for the people of Uganda, we do not have a military government, but a cabal, a group of soldiers working for an individual in this kind of transition. So if we want to deal with this kind of transition, we must deal in how we disengage the military from the person who captured it to make it Ugandan, and then we define the transition we want. My brother Godba, thank you so much for the work. Well done. How I wish even other players who are actually doing politics think about the transition more than you guys. But other guys are just talking about something else. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Angela.